Good evening and welcome to Taking Stock. There's a lot going on in the airline business on the African continent at the moment. Kenya Airways in the midst of a restructuring process, not perhaps as dramatic as SAA's that we told you about quite recently, but it is a pretty dramatic process. The new chairman joins me on Taking Stock as we look at Kenya Airways, one time a high flyer through African skies and seems to have lost its way a little bit against the likes like South Africa and against Ethiopian and other airlines. Michael Joseph, ex-telecoms executive, he started his career at the post office in South Africa, ended up running Safaricom in Kenya, and now is running that country's airway as chairman. What does a telecoms guy know about running an airline?
Nothing, which is probably an advantage in some ways. But I don't think it's very different industries, completely different. I keep on telling people this is something completely different. We don't know anything about running airlines, but what we do know is how can we change an airline, which is a massive industry, into being a very consumer-orientated business, which is what it's all about. So, yeah.
Warren Buffett, very famously, and nowadays he owns stakes in Delta and I think Southwest Airlines, he owns stakes in those, but very famously was once quoted as saying, had there been a capitalist at Kitty Hawk when the Wright brothers took off in the early 1900s, they would have shot down the Wright Flyer and saved investors billions of dollars over the next century. Airlines feel like a mug's game. You either make good money because you have a dominant position in a good territory, or you run them at a loss in perpetuity.
The challenge that you have is that you have enormous amount of fixed costs that just sit there, and you have to fly in order to make money. I remember Richard Branson apparently made a statement: if you want to be a millionaire, start as a billionaire and buy an airline. So I think he's quite right. It's a very capital-intensive industry, highly regulated, and it's very high fixed costs which are not really in your control. Fuel is an example. Fuel is not in your control at all, and yet it's about 20% of your cost. So it's very difficult business to be in. In the African context, extremely difficult to be in that business. And
what went wrong with Kenya Airways in your estimation? I know you only joined the company in 2016, and then there was a Deloitte report which suggested a whole bunch of malfeasance at multiple levels through the organization. I want to chat about that in a second. But 10 years ago, Kenya Airways was heralded like Ethiopian is today.
I think they embarked on a very big expansion plan, and they suffered a number of coincidental perfect storm kind of events that put this whole expansion plan in jeopardy. You know, we were one of the original orders for this customers for the 787, and we placed an order for 787, and they were, as you know, probably 5-6 years late. So in the meantime, in between that, we had to soldier on with very fuel inefficient aircraft and not very good aircraft. We then had the Ebola crisis in West Africa, which meant we stopped flying to West Africa, which is a very, very good route for us. And then you had the terrorism activity in Nairobi. And those 3-4 things combined really put in jeopardy the expansion plan. But also, I must admit that we did not execute the expansion plan really well. And this is the challenge that we're facing now, is how to restructure the airline, which we actually mentioned we've done, but now how do we actually take advantage of that restructuring and rebuild the airline to what it should be?
One looks at the numbers, and probably 10 years ago the airline was operating 35 aircraft. It went up into the 50s and now back down to I think 41 aircraft, the latest number I can see in your fleet. There's sort of been this wave and this almost consolidation now. But you're in an expansion phase once again. You've recently, and we're in Cape Town, where you've launched 3 flights a week now via Vic Falls and Livingston to Cape Town. It suggests that you're feeling courageous enough again to start stretching the boundaries.
I think so, because most of our growth and most of our, from a financially performance-wise, will come from Africa. From being a regional airline in Africa, because when we fly internationally, you compete with the big boys. So this is where we believe our growth can come from. And as you say, 10 flights a week to Cape Town, 3 direct. We're expanding more. We're looking at more routes so we can have the aircraft. But we have to do this cautiously. And the thing is, when you say you inaugurate your first route to a new destination, it takes 2 to 3 years before you actually start to make money on that route. And of course, you have to consider the network effect. People flying from Cape Town to Nairobi on our flight, not many of them are going to stay in Nairobi. Many of them are going to go on to other destinations, and you have to do all this calculation. But I believe that we are growing this airline, and we intend to grow. The recent development that we had now announced a few weeks ago is that we're going to take over the running of Nairobi's airport with JKA.
That is so interesting, because in South Africa we are used to having the Airports Company of South Africa, state-owned company, but it's operated independently. It runs the major airports. An airline running the airport suggests a monopolistic tendency. You run the risk there of almost excluding others to your own benefit.
If we were to follow the other examples, possibly you're right, but that's not our intention. Our intention really is Kenya Airways, as you know, is a publicly, privately owned airline. It's not a state-owned airline. Yeah. We're competing against state-owned airlines. All of our competition, in fact, is state-owned, 100% state. In some ways, also subsidized and protected by the state. We are not. We need to find a way in which we can grow. And one of the ways we looked at it is, can we take over the running of the airport? Now, we're not going to be protectionist. That's for sure not our intention. We actually want more people to fly, more aircraft, more airlines to fly into JKIA, because that means we have more revenue. So our intention is to encourage that. But it's the way in which we can get the financially strong base to grow Kenya Airways. Otherwise, we should be nationalized.
I want to talk about the shareholding structure, because South Africa is going through that very process now, and I want to discuss the best way we can do it based on your experience. But Jomo Kenyatta International at Nairobi is the opportunity for an Africa hub, just the same way as Ethiopia's got a chance to use Addis as a hub. Is there a war for dominance in East Africa?
I think it's a war for survival more than a war for dominance. You know, if you look at what Ethiopian has done, and they've done a fantastic job. You know, when Kenya Airways was at its heyday, Ethiopian had 3 or 4 aircraft. You know, now they are at the 100 aircraft. So they've done a great job. Frankly speaking, we are emulating Ethiopian. Okay. Frankly speaking, but we have a difference in Ethiopia with Addis. Addis is a transit point. Not many people stop over and stay in Addis. We're different. We want to encourage more people also to come to Nairobi and stay in Nairobi. So we're not just going to be a transit hub, but we need to, if you mentioned SAA, if you look at all of our airlines in Africa, we cannot survive and compete on a level playing field with Ethiopian, Emirates, Oman, because they have a different base in which they're competing. So if we want to survive and grow and be the national airline of Kenya, then this is what we have to do. And my selling point to the government of Kenya to do this was to say, look, you can't look at Kenya Airways as a for-profit organization. You have to look at it as a national asset, as a strategic asset of the country. And that's the way you need to look at it, because that's what the Dubai government did with Emirates, what the Ethiopian government did with Ethiopian, etc. That's how we need to look at it. If you want to have a national airline and you want to bring jobs, corporates, to Kenya, and the government, fortunately, thankfully, bought into the idea.
I want to talk about that more in just a moment. My guest is Michael Joseph, South African born, grew up through the telecommunications sector, and for the first time breaking out of the realms of that telecommunications sector 2 years ago to become the chairman of Kenya Airways, last year appointing the former chief executive of Poland's LOT Airways to run the airline operationally. It's expanding after a period of consolidation, lost money for most of the last 10 years, and trying to turn a corner. Just like SAA trying to turn a corner. SAA, completely state-owned. There's an interesting blend of ownership, however, of Kenya Airways. Perhaps a model we can look at for SAA. More with Michael Joseph in a moment.